Welcome back. Now, this section is where things start to really get exciting because we're going to create weapons. Now, one of the most powerful aspects of object-oriented programming languages is the fact that we can derive child classes from other classes. We know that the actor class contains the ability to be placed in the world, so it's already got all this stuff built into it. And what we've done is subclassed the actor. We've derived a child class called A-item based on the actor class, and we've added our own custom functionality to it. Now, we'd like to subclass this even further by creating a weapon class. And the weapon class can inherit properties from the item, but then go on to specialize its own behavior. So we know that the item has the ability to float up and down in sinusoidal movement because we're using the sine function. So we have this nice floating effect. It also has overlap and end overlap function callbacks bound to those delegates on its sphere component. And it also has an item mesh. So if we make a child class of item called weapon, it'll inherit these properties, and we won't have to just copy and paste them over to our new weapon class. Now, in addition to these features, I'd like the weapon to be able to be equipped. This means that if we press a button and we're close to the weapon, then we'll attach that weapon to the character's mesh, to the hand essentially. And we'd also like to be able to attack. So if the character has a weapon equipped, we should be able to use that weapon. If it's a sword, we'd like to swing the sword. So that's our goal for the weapon. We want to be able to interact with the world and attack things and do battle. So this is going to be really cool. And in this lecture, we're just going to set up our child class of item called the weapon. So let's get started. So if we want a weapon class, we need to make a new C++ class. So we can open C++ classes, go into /public items, because the item class is going to be the parent for our new C++ class, the weapon class. So I'm going to right-click on item, and I can choose create C++ class derived from item. If I select that, then we'll see that it wants to place this straight into the items folder. Now, we can put it inside of a weapons folder in the items folder if we like. I'm going to do that to keep things organized, and I'm going to name this class weapon. Now, we can click create class. Let's go ahead and do that. So now we have our weapon.cpp and weapon.h files, and we can see that weapon is derived from the A-item class. So it has those properties, including the capability of overlapping and end overlapping with its sphere component. So here's what I'd like to do. Let's hop back into the editor, and we're going to make a blueprint based on our C++ class. Now, there are multiple ways to do this. We can go into the items folder and make a new folder called weapons. And here in weapons, we could right-click and create a new blueprint class and select the C++ class weapon. We could also go into C++ classes /public items weapons and right-click on the weapon class here and create a blueprint class based on weapon. Either one of those has the same effect. Now, we can choose to place this in blueprints, items, weapons, and we can call this simply BP_weapon. So I'm going to create this blueprint class. And here's my blueprint. And as we can see, we have the sphere and the item mesh. And I can select that item mesh and change it by searching for sword and selecting that sword static mesh. And I can take my sphere and increase the sphere radius just a bit. And now we have a weapon blueprint. Now, just to make sure that everything still works as expected, I'm going to delete this BP item from the world and instead drag in my BP weapon. So I need to go to Blueprints, Items, Weapons, find BP weapon, and drag it in. And I'm going to drag it up a little bit and press play. Now I see that it's not hovering, but if I overlap and end overlap, I do get that functionality. Now, why aren't we getting our hovering behavior, that sinusoidal movement? Well, let's see. Let's go back into our Visual Studio project. I don't need primitive component.h. I'm going to close that. And I'd like to go into my private folder, into items, and open item.cpp. And scrolling down to the tick function, we see that all we're doing is keeping track of running time. And remember, our sinusoidal functions, transformed sine and transformed cosine, those are exposed to blueprints. We can check in our public folder in items in item.h and see that these are blueprint pure functions, and we're calling these in the item blueprint. So if we go back and open up our item blueprint in the items folder, BP item, we see that we're adding an actor world offset in event tick. So what if we want this functionality in our weapon class? Well, we can call transformed sine. So if we copy these two nodes and go back to BP weapon and paste them in, we can hook this up to event tick. And if I press play, now my weapon is hovering. So that's the power of inheritance. This transformed sine blueprint pure function is defined in the item class, but our weapon is an item. It derives from that class. So it inherits that function, which is great. Now, we do want our item to specialize. We want it to do different things when we overlap and end overlap. So we want the best of both worlds. We want the ability to overlap and end overlap and have something happen as a result, but we would like our own custom behavior for the weapon. So how do we do that? Well, the way we do it is we can override our overlap functions. Here they are, on-sphere overlap and on-sphere end overlap. Now, in order to override these functions in the weapon class, we need to make them virtual. And we do that by marking them with the virtual keyword just before the function declaration. We're going to do this for on-sphere overlap and on-sphere end overlap. We're going to make them both virtual. And then we can override them in the weapon class, which means we need to declare them in the weapon class. So we can copy these lines here where we're declaring the functions, and we can declare them here in weapon.h. Now these are protected functions, so we're going to make a protected section. And I'm just going to paste them right here. Now here's a very important detail. These functions are declared in item, and they're declared with ufunction macros. Now we can't have these ufunction macros on the override. We have to remove them, otherwise we'll get compilation errors. The fact that these functions are ufunctions is an inherited quality. So it's like there's a ufunction macro there, we just can't see it. That ufunction is inherited. So we need to make sure that our overrides do not have ufunction on them. But what we can do is mark these as overrides. So right at the end, just inside that last semicolon, we're going to mark these with the override keyword. And this does a couple of things. First of all, it tells the compiler that we think this is an override. So the compiler, once we compile, is going to look into parent classes and make sure there is a virtual function with this name. And if there's not, it'll tell us, and we'll get a compilation error. So it's for our safety. And also, it tells anyone who looks at this function that this is an override. Likewise, adding virtual at the beginning tells us this is a virtual function. But if we're overriding a virtual function, this function is already a virtual function. So adding virtual at the beginning here in the override in the child class is optional, and it's more for our documentation purposes to tell us that this is an override. So now that we're overriding these functions, let's add function definitions for both of them. So I'm going to go ahead and add these definitions. And now I have them here in weapon.cpp. Now that I've overridden these functions, we're not going to get that parent version of the function called for either of these. That doesn't happen by default. So if I click Save All and go back into the editor and hot reload, then after the hot reload, if I press play and go and overlap with the weapon, I don't get those messages anymore. That doesn't happen by default. In order to get the parent version called, we have to call the super version of on-sphere overlap and on-sphere end overlap. So what we can do is call super on-sphere overlap, and that's how we get the version on the parent class called. But on-sphere overlap takes 6 input parameters. Well, we do have access to those. They're the inputs for the function. We have the overlapped component. We can pass that straight in. We have the other actor. We can pass that in. We have the uPrimitive component called otherComp. We'll pass in that one. We have the int32 called otherBodyIndex, which we'll also pass in. After that, we have b from sweep and sweep result. I'm just going to type those in. So b from sweep and sweep result. And now we're satisfying all those input parameters for on-sphere overlap, and this is the parent version. I'm going to call super for on-sphere end overlap as well. So we're going to call super, and I'm just going to copy this function signature here and paste it in, but we don't want the types. We're just passing in the values straight in. So I'll remove those types and just pass in overlapped component, other actor, other comp, and other body index. And that satisfies the 4 input parameters for on-sphere end overlap. Now I can save all and hop back into the editor and hot reload. And now when I press play and overlap and end overlap, I do get those functions called because we're calling those parent functions on the item class. And this gives us a very nice opportunity to get the best of both worlds. We get the parent version called, and now weapon can define what it does in its own version, its own override of these functions. So we need to decide what we do when we overlap with a weapon. We'd like to be able to pick it up, right? So we're going to learn all the skills that we need to do what we need to do once we overlap and end overlap with weapons. And we'll start talking about how to go about doing that in the next video. Great job. I'll see you soon.